The Many Means of Dark Souls 2, do Skyen. Gosto muito desse canal, que volta e meia patrocinado aqui, em particular pelo Blue, que foi quem patrocinou esse vídeo também. A parada que o Blue falou, cara, vê até o minuto 6. Mas o vídeo tem 48 minutos. Aí eu tô enrolando pra ver, porque eu queria pelo menos dar uma chance pra ver os 48 minutos, né? Então vambora. Vamos ver sobre o que esse vídeo exatamente faz de Dark Souls 2.
Hello, explorers and essayists.
Deixa eu botar... De vez em quando, o Skyen em particular não fica em 1080p, não sei porquê. Vambora.
Hello, explorers and essayists. My name is TB Skyen, and welcome to the many meanings of Dark Souls 2. And my god, does it feel good to be able to talk again.
Falar é ótimo, né, Skyen? Sou muito fã de falar. É por isso que esse é meu trabalho.
I've had to shut up for so long because of this goddamn oral surgery, and now that I can talk, I
Dark Souls 2 é GOT? Vamos com calma, irmão.
will never shut up again. Anyway, in August of 2019, which, as I write this, in August of 2020, is approximately 500 years ago, I started a gameplay and analysis series taking a close look at Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin.
Cara, dessa versão...
The conceit of the series is that I stumbled...
Nunca joguei Dark Souls 2, mas o Fernandes é chatinho. O Fernandes Dark Souls 2, ele sofre daquela parada que o Fernandes de Bleach sofre, tá ligado? Todo mundo odeia essa porra, então a galera fica muito protetiva. Eu já tive um problema com o Fernandes de Bleach por causa disso, mas a galera protege muito as próprias coisas, então eles ficam muito chatos. Aí qualquer coisa pequena, que é tipo, não, isso é bom, vira a melhor coisa de todos os tempos. Aí é meio blé, tá ligado? É um fandom merda, mas é porque todo mundo caiu em cima dele durante muito tempo.
Into the game blind, not knowing anything about the story or the characters before playing, and take on the bosses as I find them. Then, I produce a video each week analyzing the character designs, stories, and themes of each boss in turn. In Dark Souls 2, as I went along, I ended up settling on the idea of the game as a metaphorical journey through life, with each boss broadly representing various ways a person can get stuck, taken off track, or lose themselves on that journey. I leaned heavily on themes of personal identity and psychology and drew on my education as a historian and my various personal interests. I personally find the process of looking into my own experience and my feelings and really figuring out what I think about a piece of media enormously rewarding. It's a way to find fun in places I normally wouldn't, like, for example, in a series of video games renowned for their punishing difficulty and obtuse, ambiguous storytelling.
Mas o fato de ser uma narrativa punitiva e ambígua, obtusa e ambígua, é tipo, bom, tá ligado? Eu gosto disso. É parte do motivo pelo qual eu gosto. Eu gosto de tentar descobrir as coisas, eu gosto de tentar entender as coisas.
I had written Dark Souls off as a series that just wasn't for me for years until, at the urging of a friend...
O que é obtuso? Obtuso é tipo, difícil de compreender, muito, sabe, tipo, difícil de compreender, é isso. Não te dá informações.
Started making my video series and had to look closer and really pay attention. Now, it's one of my most beloved video game experiences.
Same.
But this video...
Obtuso é uma palavra obtusa, exatamente. É que nem críptico. É a mesma coisa que críptico, pô.
Isn't really about my series. It's about you.
Eu!
On YouTube, as in life, a lot of media tends to rely on authoritative declarations. Top 10 best action scenes of 2017. Avengers was a terrible movie and here's why.
É porque é mais fácil de você vender a sua opinião assim, especialmente na internet. Então, né?
How
Esse é o Blue Sky ou eu tô maluco? Sim, é o Skyen, pô.
Disney ruined Star Wars. This is not
Donas pra vídeo gringo, a legenda pode ser automática? Prefiro que não. Porque muitas vezes não funciona bem. Tem que ter legenda em inglês que dá pra traduzir.
Intrinsically a bad thing. I do it myself from time to time, and it is certainly what the site's all-powerful algorithm prefers, but I do want to push back.
É TB Sky, mas não sei porque ele falou Blue Sky, mas agora é Blue Sky também, eu acho.
Back on that a little bit.
Inclusive, o Film Night é uma das lutas mais legais desse jogo inteiro, só que jogar com outras pessoas é esquisito, tá?
Boss designs of Dark Souls 2, I try to emphasize that what I do in my videos is not really special. You can do it too, and I think you should.
Entendi qual é a vibe disso. É tipo, várias pessoas vão estar analisando Dark Souls 2, isso é interessante. Isso é bem interessante.
I mean, maybe not to the point of spending a year creating a 36-part video series about a 2015 dark fantasy hack and slash. Unless you want to, I'd be curious to see it. But the act of media criticism isn't exclusive to pretentious people with university degrees and semi-successful YouTube channels.
Eu me senti atacado.
It isn't
Mas sim, é verdade, tá?
exclusive to the professionals, whoever the hell they are, or critics.
Pô, mas assim, Dark Souls 2 tem um estilo tão legal pra mim, pelo menos. Eu vou dar meus takes sobre Dark Souls 2 tematicamente depois. A gente vai ver o vídeo inteiro aqui no... A gente vai ver esse vídeo inteiro pra ver os significados que a galera tava trazendo.
Or experts.
E aí eu vou dar minhas visões também, vambora.
A discipline that belongs to all of us. We can all of us produce meaningful thoughts and ideas about the games we play. So, at the end of my series, I asked my audience to give that a shot, to write to me, and tell me what this game meant to them, so that I could collect those
Um é 4 minutos, outro é 12. Tranquilo, Maia. Como a gente vai ver esse vídeo inteiro, talvez eu não veja seu vídeo hoje, mas aí eu vejo amanhã.
thoughts and ideas here,
Se não for um problema.
and make a video about the most interesting ones. The response was, slightly overwhelming.
Normal. Muito normal.
So, the essays that are collected here are taken with permission from the comments underneath my video, from emails that people have sent to me, and from private messages sent on social media. I've edited them for grammar and spelling and consistency, but sometimes I have also made more substantial edits to sentence structure, phrasing, and general clarity of language. These edits were made in the name of accessibility, especially for people who don't speak English as a first language, and I've tried very hard to make sure that none of my edits change the meaning or the ideas that are being communicated. Finally, I have made a few edits to some of the essays to omit personal details and information which I would not personally feel comfortable broadcasting publicly in a document like this, even with consent. I have also added titles to each essay to make them easier to search through to find a perspective that you might find interesting. Now, I received 85 essays in total, and the final word count of the document that I collected them all into was over 50,000 words.
Lança um livro ao invés de um vídeo, então, ô irmão.
Which, for context, is about as long as the average commercial novel.
Exatamente, eu tô ligado disso.
For that reason, we can't go through all of them in this particular video, but the full document of every single essay with an...
Pior que é muito legal essa interação com o público de um produto mais nichado, porque geralmente essa é a galera mais apaixonada que consegue fazer as melhores análises com críticos e elogios à obra. Sim, então, tipo, quando eu fiz meus vídeos de Hotline Miami, uma coisa que eu fiquei muito feliz, não só foi quantas pessoas eu consegui deixar interessadas no jogo, mas quantas pessoas começaram a falar de Hotline Miami. No do segundo jogo, quando eu fiz minha análise do segundo jogo, eu perguntei para as pessoas o que elas achavam que era o Richard. E foi muito legal de ler. Porque é realmente um bagulho muito nichado. Então quem tava interessado em entender o que era o Richard, ia lá e comentava. E eu achava muito da hora. Eu achava muito bom de ler. Teve umas teorias interessantes ali.
Annotations with my edits and a fully organized table of content.
Eu gosto de falar de conteúdo nicho, assim. O problema é que não é o conteúdo nicho que vende. Então, é isso.
To make it easy to search through them is available as a PDF with the download link down in the description. I fully recommend that you at least check this document out. Go look through the various titles of essays, see if there's something there that catches your eye and might be interesting to inform your own perspectives on Dark Souls 2. It's been tremendously fascinating for me to read through these because to me it proves the point that I've been trying to make with the whole series, that this stuff is available to everyone, that everyone can look for more, deeper meaning in the things, in the media that they consume. The ideas in these essays range from analyses and reviews of the game's mechanic and how fun or not it is to play to personal stories about friendships and community found through...
Esse é de Dark Souls 2? Exatamente. Opa, Danael, o que eu perdi? A gente tá vendo um vídeo onde várias pessoas vão dar seus takes de Dark Souls 2 tematicamente em significados.
The game's multiplayer mode, to thematic meditations on the lore and story and themes of the game, to funny stories about accidentally building a caveman character or using the game as a way to get revenge on spiders for your arachnophobia. They are, all of them, in my opinion, every bit as valid and interesting as...
Boa tarde, Maurício Danas. Dark Souls 2 é bom sim. Quem fala mal tá errado. Brincadeira. Tem coisas boas aqui e ali. Eu concordo com você, Ignoro. Tem coisas boas aqui e ali. Mas é complicado. É complicado.
Any video series I could produce. So, enjoy this small selection from the many meanings of Dark Souls 2. Download the full document with the link down in the description. And please, if you have your own thoughts or if this inspires anything in you, let me know in the comments down below.
Ele fez um cosplay de Jesus enquanto eu usei esse capacete de bobo da corte. Tá bom.
My first Dark Souls 2 experience was probably very different from most other experiences. One of my friends is a huge Dark Souls fan and gifted me Dark Souls 2 for my birthday, so that
Fala, LD! Ih, Raid do LD, muitíssimo obrigado, LD Speedruns. Quem não conhece aqui do Maurício LD e também da galera do canal de cortes, tapa na cara de vocês, vão lá assistir coisas do LD, muito brabo, o speedrunner é muito brabo. Sejam todos bem-vindos aqui. Tamo vendo um vídeo onde várias pessoas dão seus takes de Dark Souls 2, geralmente mais tematicamente, tipo, o que o jogo significou pra eles, os caras 4, e a gente vai fazer isso também, dar nossos takes aqui. Então espero que curtem e muito obrigado de novo pela raid.
we could play together. However, he was so excited to show me everything he loved about this game that he got very overenthusiastic. The game was really no challenge anymore since he knew basically all there is to know about it, easily soloing most bosses and enemies. Thus, it felt less like a dangerous adventure and more like a guided tour through a theme park or a museum. It got more and more ridiculous as time went on with
Eu acho que essa é uma parada inteira de sempre que, tipo, quando você é jovem e seu amigo tenta te apresentar um jogo como Dark Souls pra você, ele não vai calar a boca. Então você vai jogar e sabendo de tudo. Eu tenho um amigo, que é o Léo, que eu já falei aqui antes. Eu lembro que ele jogou Bloodborne depois de ver o playthrough de Bloodborne. Então ele meio que já sabia o que ele tem que enfrentar. Eu não sei dizer se isso estraga ou melhora a experiência, eu acho que depende pra você. Mas acho que pra essa pessoa foi...
with him doing a cosplay of Jesus and spamming miracles, while I wore the Jester helmet, which I had combined with the onion armor. This ludicrous spectacle peaked when we had another friend join us for the DLC areas, and I got invaded by a player with bright purple anime hair who was named Bad Waifu. After repeatedly getting beat up by 3 players, Bad Waifu decided to just tag along for a while and
Trocou de mic, Thanos? Tá meio baixinho. Troquei tem um tempo, já tinha aumentado ele, mas acho que tá baixo de novo. Posso tentar aumentar aqui mais um pouquinho no... E aqui, tá melhor? Melhorou? Melhorou? Também porque eu sem querer dei uma porradinha na assistitividade, calma aí. Tá melhor? Tá melhor, gente? Melhorou? Tá tranquilo? Tá de boas? O problema é que você fala... Se eu gritar, estoura! Então deixa eu ter que abaixar um pouquinho aqui, tá. Acho que aqui tá bom! Agora sim, vambora.
help us clear the area. At first, when the playthrough began, I was a bit annoyed.
O único que eu joguei sem saber coisa de lore foi o Sekiro. Eu não sei nada da lore de Sekiro. Nada. E eu também não sei muito da lore de Elden Ring. Tô me descobrindo com o tempo, né?
Wanting to experience the adventure for myself, alone.
Danael, espero que Deus tenha amaldiçoado seu rosto, porque se você for tão gostoso quanto sua voz, significa que ele não é justo. Calma que eu sou um puta gostoso de todas as formas possíveis. E meu rosto é público na internet, eu só não mostro muito.
Way it seemed to be intended, but the further we got, the more I grew content with it. I may not have had time to stop and analyze the game and figure out the finer details of the lore, but what I got was a unique experience. It seems to me that the wacky co-op/PvP side of the Soul series plays second fiddle when compared to the solitary experience that the narrative seems to convey, but in my first playthrough, that trend was reversed. The epic bosses, creepy areas, the melancholic lore were all just set dressing for our goofing around.
Isso é divertido, na verdade. Conceito legal de pegar essa experiência super dark e deixar ela leve. Por estar jogando com os amigos. Maneiro.
Experiences such as this also happen in regular single-player playthroughs. See, for example, the fight between Lunatic Thinker and Upfront Gaming in episode 16 of this series, but they only lighten up the mood for a short time before you have to return to your solitary quest once again. Playing this game entirely
É tipo aquela animação Rap Souls, é uma vibe Rap Souls, sim.
in co-op with someone who knows it reversed this feeling, and made my first playthrough very different from how most others experienced it. The lore and world were kinda lost under our goofy shenanigans, but what I remember about this game is the time I spent with my friends. TLDR, my first Dark Souls experience was the friends I played with along the way. I really don't have a reading of this game, as I did with Dark Souls 1, and I'm not as interested in giving it one, since I can't help see the game as a sort of playground, and I'm having difficulty separating it from that context.
Eu tenho uma coisa parecida com isso, mas eu vou deixar pra falar mais depois. Macbeth com dragões.
So, my reading of Dark Souls 2 had been tainted.
Tá, ok, ele vai falar aqui, ele vai falar sobre a leitura dele, então eu vou falar o que eu ia falar, tipo, da minha própria visão de Dark Souls 2. Qual que é a parada sobre Dark Souls 2? Ele é o jogo da From, fora o que eu não joguei, e fora o que eu estou jogando agora, que eu menos sei da lore, e é de propósito. Por quê? Por que de propósito? Quando eu joguei Dark Souls 2 pela primeira vez, ele me deu uma vibe melancólica que eu não sentia em um jogo. Acho que eu nunca tinha sentido antes, na verdade. Porque não era que nem só Dark Souls 1, que você tá vendo, tipo, um mundo morrendo aos poucos. E é, tipo, trágico, e você vai vendo a situação ficando cada vez pior e tal. É, tipo, a paleta de cores e a vibe dos NPCs e o mundo e a trilha sonora. Até uma trilha sonora, tipo, Old Dragon Slayer, que é pra ser épica, ela é meio, tipo, desesperada e meio cansada. É um jogo que ele parece cansado. E ele passa a vibe pra mim de o mundo acabou e ninguém se importou. O mundo teve um fim, ninguém ligou pra isso. E eu adoro essa leitura. Eu adoro a atmosfera e a vibe inteira de Dark Souls 2 por isso. Então eu nunca tive interesse em ir atrás da lore de Dark Souls 2, porque eu gosto disso. Eu gosto só ter a experiência de eu tô em um mundo que acabou. É tipo o apocalipse mais deprimente de todos os tempos. E eu só tô aqui, tipo, vivendo a minha vida após isso. Pode não ser o que está acontecendo no jogo. Eu li algumas coisinhas do que acontece no jogo, justamente porque eu já fiz alguns vídeos de Dark Souls. Eu tinha que saber pelo menos algumas coisas, mas eu nunca quis ir a fundo porque eu gosto de ter essa minha leitura, essa minha visão da minha primeira experiência, e que ainda é a visão que eu tenho. Eu adoro essa vibe, sinto que os discos de áudio combinam com isso. E tem um pouquinho disso também, eu lembro que o áudio falou isso. É mais ou menos o que acontece no jogo, se não me engano. E é ótimo saber, só que aí eu não quero dar uma olhada muito a fundo, porque eu acho que em Dark Souls 2 especificamente, deixar as coisas mais abertas da minha imaginação é mais fascinante. Tipo, o mundo acabou, ninguém se importou, e por que eu deveria me importar? Por isso eu adoro que tem a porra do Lord Vessel destruído em um cantinho de Majula. Dentro de uma mansão de Majula você encontra só o Lord Vessel destruído. Por quê? Porque foda-se, ninguém se importa. A vibe de ninguém se importa é muito boa pra esse jogo. Isso parece um ataque ao jogo, mas não é. É só, tipo, bom, eu acho tematicamente, na história do jogo, muito legal. Tipo, uma vibe interessante.
Started, as I had pointed out to me some of its plot and thematic references to Macbeth, and for quite a while, I just called it
Será que tem como deixar a legenda um pouquinho mais, tipo, visível?
Macbeth with dragons. And there's definitely some merit there. The
Deixa eu subir você um pouquinho mais. Deixa aqui, tá bom.
Firekeepers are the three witches, Nashandra is Lady Macbeth, the pursuer is Banquo, and, the giants being trees, by the transitive properties of Macbeth, a forest attacks a
Não sabia que podia fazer isso, também não.
castle. It's there. My first actual playthrough with any conviction started after I saw the first episode of boss designs of Dark Souls 2. I wanted to have
Você tem que empurrar um pouquinho pro lado, porque tá um pouquinho na frente, né? Então, aqui tá bom, eu acho. Acho que aqui tá tranquilo.
my take on the game as I watched you play it. It struck me how unreal the world was, how it seemed not to respect space and time, how much less grounded it was than Dark Souls
Deixa na agenda, fica ainda mais o de o mundo acabou, ninguém ligou. É, justo.
1. More fantastical, fairy tale-like, and, in stark contrast, how much happier it was. In Dark Souls 1, every undead you shepherded off to Firelink ran the risk of hollowing. Everyone in Majula actually stays there, and if you talk to Salden, it's implied that they develop a bit of a community. Dark Souls 2 is filled with a lot of tragedy, but ultimately also hope.
Esperança porque o mundo acabou. Acabou o mundo, tem que construir de novo.
And lots of it. My first character ended up being a jack of all trades, a sword, a halberd, a bow, a shield, some pyromancy, some miracles.
Põe sensei pra baixo? Caralho, eu já tô ficando confuso. Estão felizes? Acho que agora tá no meio, né? Espero que esteja. Vambora.
It felt prudent to prepare for a vast array of challenges and environments. But, in the end, I didn't prove myself a monarch.
Não, põe você aqui do meu lado. Parem de flertar comigo!
I visited none of the locked-away lands of adversity. This had me confront Nashandra as a mere undead, susceptible to the curse, burning away my humanity just to fight. Finally, spent, my resources depleted, my strength at its limits, I managed to beat Death herself and ascend the throne of Want. I've since replayed the game many times, every time as a different build, Hexer, Paladin, Cleric, Bleeder, Poisoner, you name it. Unlike in Dark Souls 1, I have no preferred method.
Porque Dark Souls 2 tem muito mais builds, isso é bem verdade. Eu gosto mais disso até. Dark Souls 1 parece que eu sempre faço a mesma coisa com o passar do tempo. Tipo, depois de ter jogado muito. Dark Souls 2, a primeira vez que eu joguei foi. Eu joguei de Guts, basicamente. Joguei com uma espadona que tinha 40. Basicamente com a espada do Guts pré-Dragon Slayer, porque ela era parecida também. Foi só isso, foi força. É isso.
Dark Souls 2
É só o 3 espadão do Guts? Não, tem no 2 também. Espadão pré-Dragon Slayer.
lets you embrace whatever means you choose. It lets you be yourself,
Todo mundo acaba com Guts, é divertido. Sim, Bonk é divertido.
whoever you might be. Dark Souls 2 is, to me, a magical journey, a fairy tale where you discover what kind of character you want to be, and it lets you embrace it. Or Macbeth with dragons.
Too long didn't read, ou seja, tipo, muito texto. Eu sou niilista pra caralho. Ou eu sou um otário niilista, algo do estilo.
I remember reaching the original Dark Souls 2 ending. Despite not having any expectation, as I hadn't played Dark Souls 1 at the time, I remember it feeling
Eu gosto de gatos também, negancinha. Gatos são bons.
hollow. No choice, no agency, just another pawn of fate fulfilling their role in this pointless, endless cycle. Light, dark, it's all the same. We were shackled to this fate, with no other choice, kill or be killed, take the souls of others, or hollow. This frustration about the lack of choices was present throughout the entire experience. There was only the illusion of choice. No matter how hard you tried, you couldn't save anyone or do anything meaningful. The people you cared about would lose faith and go hollow, and eventually none of your achievements would amount to anything more than a new set of ruins, and another boss for the next undead to overcome. Aldia presented an out. For all his flaws as a person, he was driven by a need to break this cycle. His "there is no path" were the most liberating words in the entire game. Finally,
Ei, olha só.
I could do something of my own accord, rather than being bound to a fate by the mistakes of a king long forgotten. Yes, we're still following the path that someone else has set out for us, but at the very least, it is something new.
Eu acho que isso é uma parada em, tipo, todos os Dark Souls, né? Porque devido à questão de mecânica, você sempre vai ter que seguir, tipo, o que alguém diz pra você. E aí em Dark Souls 1, por exemplo, ou você acende a chama ou você deixa ela apagar. Ainda assim, alguém falou isso pra você, a não ser que você, na cagada, só saiu de lá e sabia que era uma opção. Mas é isso.
We know that taking the throne is pointless, but there's hope that there may be another way. What happens if we ignore this fate?
E eu gosto também que, tipo, se você pegar o trono, sentar no Throne of Want, você não começa o New Game Plus direto, você só volta pra Majula, como se nada tivesse acontecido. Eu acho que tem um NPC que fala, você é o rei, parabéns. Foda-se.
What if the next undead does not find a hollow king sitting on his throne, but no king at all? It may be a false choice, yes, but a choice that has some hope of succeeding, unlike the alternative. In a meaningless world, the only meaning that matters is the one that we make for ourselves.
Concordo.
I choose to follow my curiosity, for better or for worse. TLDR, I'm a nihilistic ass, and this game did a pretty good job at channeling and dealing with that.
Bom, maneiro. A coisa mais ativa que você pode fazer é recuperar os olhos da mina no Firelink Dark Souls 3 pra ele matar ela no fim do jogo. É verdade. De resto, parece que todo jogo da From é tipo, alguém te dá as opções, ao invés de você ir atrás das opções. A mídia mais importante, mais relevante da minha vida. É isso.
I was pretty depressed when I first played Dark Souls 2.
Também.
It was
Também.
a dark moment in my life, and I just finished Dark Souls 1 and was absolutely in love with the game and its story. I immediately fell in love with Dark Souls 2, but in different ways than the first game. Dark Souls 2 had a decent online presence at the time, so I made lots of friends and had an absolute blast playing it. But there's something more Dark Souls 2 did to me besides offer me fun in a difficult time. You know that coffin at the tutorial area of the game where you can change your gender? Well, that thing fascinated me. My entire life I was unhappy with the
Olha só, que legal.
body that was assigned to me, and I always dreamed of this magical coffin which could magically transform me into a girl in the blink of an eye. Needless to say, this is impossible in real life, but that coffin served as a door to my self-discovery journey into gender and sexuality. A journey that eventually led me to a more reasonable and realistic desire to transition. It's funny, really, how, if not for Dark Souls 2 showing me that I have the choice to be who I want to be, I probably wouldn't be a transgender woman right now. Lol. Dark Souls 2 was the most relevant game, actually the most relevant piece of media in my life. and no amount of bad reviews and disappointed gamers can change its importance to me.
Foda, na verdade, muito legal. A grande questão é que, tipo, independente. Achei fofo, achei muito fofo, sim, achei muito foda. Independente de uma arte, de uma mídia, ser boa ou não, ou você odiar, você não gostar e tal, eu geralmente, tem várias exceções, mas eu geralmente estou feliz que ela existe. Porque ela provavelmente ajudou alguém. Mídia tá aí, arte está aí pra te ajudar de alguma maneira, pra você se conectar de alguma maneira, pra você pegar partes e levar pra sua própria vida. Então, se alguma coisa como Dark Souls 2 fez com que uma pessoa se descobrisse trans, isso é muito foda. E eu acho que a vibe, tipo, tem que apagar esse jogo da existência. Se apagasse esse jogo da existência, essa pessoa não teria sido uma pessoa mais feliz agora, sabe? Uma pessoa que se entende melhor. Isso é muito bom, isso é muito irado. Uma massa. Um pedaço de pau grande pra caralho. É uma tradução livre.
I don't really play much Dark Souls.
Nerd.
I played Dark Souls 2 until the Throne Defenders and just stopped. I just really liked swinging my sword and putting on new clothes.
Um porrete grande pra caralho, obrigado.
Now, the funny thing about Dark Souls 2 is that there are rags that improve drop chances. I wore those rags at all times because I wanted more stuff, more clothes, more swords, more
Eu gosto dessa pessoa. Essa pessoa, ela tem a minha mentalidade uga-buga. Eu adoro.
everything. And then eventually, I found a really big f***off club. This club scaled massively with strength and had funny and powerful attacks, so I used it. At the end, I just ran around in rags, wielding a giant goddamn stick, beating down monsters, knights, and all sorts of beasties. While others advanced...
Ele tem sangue lutador de Skyrim? Até a voz que o Skyen tá fazendo pra esse cara é satisfatório. Eu consigo sentir o Uga Buga. Eu consigo sentir aquele brinquedo de macaquinho batendo os dois pratos de bateria, tá ligado? Um no outro. É assim que o cérebro dele funciona. E é assim que meu cérebro também funciona. Então eu fiquei feliz.
in technology and magical power, I just pumped up strength and endurance. At the end of my journey, I had become a caveman.
Hell yeah!
Me want more stuff. Give stuff.
Brabo! Manos do Sol até o fim.
There I was, after having a horrible first playthrough of Dark Souls 1, full of fear, indecisiveness, scared, and going through difficult times, even resorting
Aí se bom, cai bom. Exatamente.
to guides and tricks to make it easier, when a friend of mine asked me if we could play Dark Souls 2 together. I agreed, even though I didn't know if I really wanted another Dark Souls 1 experience, because I cared about my friend, and also I wanted to try again with this beloved series that I just couldn't seem to enjoy. And after guiding me through Discord towards the White Soapstone to play co-op, my best gaming experience ever started. We would laugh off deaths, enjoy exploring together, and he would guide me through one of his favorite games. We were each other's son bro, and we would fight every boss with a smile on our face.
Oh.
Dark Souls, to me, as a series, works best when you have someone else to lift the weight of the difficulty of it.
Eu acho que é o caso de, tipo, depende da pessoa. Eu não gosto de jogar... É porque eu não sou muito também de jogar, tipo, co-op com pessoas, em geral. Mas Dark Souls, em particular, é um jogo que eu não vejo... Não me parece muito uma coisa que eu curtiria tanto assim. Eu prefiro a experiência sozinha. Então, justíssimo.
Mind you, I eventually got good, and now I enjoy beating the bosses alone because I finally had the chance to learn, to understand how to play. Dark Souls 1 just didn't let up, and I couldn't keep up, so I got left behind. Well, we started Dark Souls 2.
E também é o caso, tipo, você tá jogando com um amigo e o amigo tá, tipo, te ajudando. Tipo, tá falando o que você deveria pegar. Porque, como ele mesmo falou, é o jogo favorito do amigo. Então, irado.
I was pretty much a newborn to the series. Pretty fitting, I'd say. So we went on a journey together as friends, as a brave warrior with his weirdo companion cleric / pyromancer, that is me.
Boa.
Towards every boss, every struggle. We survived together, unlike the many people of Drang Lake who traveled alone.
Isso é uma coisa que tu falta em Sekiro, mesmo sabendo que não faz sentido nenhum pra aquele jogo. Tem outra maneira de enfrentar bosses e andar por aí, ia ser muito legal. Famoso não importa que não faz sentido pro jogo, cara. Tipo, ter 2 Sekiros em Sekiro não é ruim não, tá ligado? Mas e o Elden Dark Blood Ultimate Souls Co-op? Esse eu vou jogar. Esse eu vou jogar co-op também, porque o jogo foi pensado nisso. Mas vamos ver se, tipo, eu vou acabar preferindo experiência single player, porque tem como, né? Então, vamos ver.
And ended up dying, or ended up losing what made them human. Aldia went alone. Lucatiel went alone. The many pursuers perished one by one. Even Vendrick, who had a right hand, who had someone wanting to follow him, still didn't realize what he had, and he just let himself rot and die. And so did Velstad. And after 155 hours of playtime, we got all of the achievements of Dark Souls 2. That's how much I loved this game.
Caralho.
And I can only say that because I had someone to help me through it, help me learn it, help me love it. Thank you, Maxi. Sunbros till the end.
Fofo! Outro fofo. A visão anarquista. Vambora.
The Anarchist View. Dark Souls 2, to me, is a story about the removal of unjust power structures.
Pau no cu da monarquia.
You begin the game with a quest, become
Morte ao rei.
powerful enough to become the new king, but why does one get to lead simply because
Chega de fofura. Ah, então, relaxa. Agora estamos no anarquismo. Vambora.
they are the strongest among us? You start with the last giant, an unfortunate victim of imperialism, and put him out of
Esse vai ser Ed? Não, esse vai ser Woke.
his misery. You continue through the game, stopping undead from being tortured by the chariot simply because of who they are. Then you come to your first king, a horrible, twisted man bathed in molten iron. You destroy him, and the abomination he turned the one friend he had into. Sometime later, your purpose changes. Now, not only do you have to overthrow this king, but others that have ruled in the past.
Monarquia é broke, anarquismo é woke, sim. Então quer dizer que você pode tirar uma visão woke e não woke de um mesmo game? Sim. Aparentemente sim.
So you eliminate one that would use religion to subjugate his people, and one that we have already discussed. You also destroy perhaps the only good king, the one who would put himself between danger and his people. But how do we know that his heir would do the same?
Eu nem lembro quem que deveria ser essa pessoa, tudo bem. I still see your shadows in my room.
After they topple, you face our final challenge. A queen who covets all power for herself, regardless of the
Pau no cu da Narchandra.
consequences.
E de todo mundo.
After you defeat her, you defeat Aldia, a man who puts knowledge above people. After that, when the choice is given, you don't ascend the throne. For when you are king, no matter how well you do, there will always be another you, one who isn't pleased with the system and will eventually overthrow you. But how can a king be overthrown if one does not exist?
Essa é da DLC? É, pode ser, não lembro.
You leave the throne of want, and you begin to show people how hierarchies need not exist. In my headcanon, anyway.
Justo. Justo. Um remix de lenda arturiana.
I'd like to offer my take that Dark Souls 2 is a kind of remix of Arthurian legend. Like Camelot, Drang Lake is a prosperous kingdom with
Ah, da DLC quando você pega as 3 coroas. Mas qual dos 3 reis? Não, mas só tem um rei, né? A gente luta só contra o Ivory King lá. É, sim, faz sentido.
stalwart knights and a wise
Com a sessão de às vezes o Gabuga, eu o Gabuga sempre que possível.
king, and like Camelot, it has fallen. Aldia is a Merlin figure of sorts. Nashandra is Guinevere and Morgan Le Fay wrapped up in one package.
Pior que faz muito sentido tudo que ele tá falando agora. Ok, beleza. Vamos... Tá cozinhando, deixa ele cozinhar que faz sentido.
The wicked queen who brings down the king with wars caused by her desires. I think Velstad might be Lancelot, his hex is darkened soul, and the fact that he's summoned by Alana hints that he might have had some contact with the dark. Maybe intimate contact, and perhaps he's doing penance in the crypt. Vendrick is King Arthur, of course, who did not
Yes.
die, but was sealed away in a magic place. It's just that Arthur is imagined as sleeping in Avalon, while Vendrick's undying state is somewhat more horrifying to behold. But he's also the Fisher King. The Fisher King has grievous wounds that do not heal, but does not die either. He's also the guardian of the Holy Grail, and only the chosen knight can heal him and reach the Grail.
Mas quem que é o Derpel? Ah!
The Grail is portrayed as the cup Christ drank from at the Last Supper, but even in its own legends, it's clear that the Grail is a metaphor. The Grail itself, that is, the Throne of Want in Drang Lake, is ultimately unimportant. It's the quest that matters. The quest for
Literalmente, sim.
the Grail is the search for holiness. It's not something most people are capable of ever achieving, but yet it is good and proper to reach for it. In other words, you need to get good, and if you get good enough to beat the final boss, that's your actual reward.
Eu, sinceramente, adorei essa leitura, na verdade. Essa leitura foi, não ironicamente, muito da hora. Tipo, de verdade mesmo. O final é melhor que jornada, o final dá sentido à jornada? Depende, Blue, depende. Dois amigos, um bong Dark Souls, vambora.
6 years ago now, when I was 19 in college, I offered weed to a guy at a party at my dorm. Everyone was new and nobody really knew each other yet, so he hit me up a few more times to go smoke together. And at some point, the subject of Dark Souls came up. He asked me...
Eu não sei como dizer isso de uma maneira que faz sentido, mas eu não consigo, pela minha vida, imaginar alguém jogando Dark Souls chapado. Tipo, parece uma experiência agonizante. Tá ligado? Tipo, você tem sentido, você imagina que fica tipo, muito mais lento os caralho a 4. Então alguma coisa como Dark Souls é só frustrante? Eu não sei.
If I'd ever played it, and I must have said something like no, but I did play some of Demon's Souls.
Não é tão difícil? Sei lá.
And I was up for a challenging game, so if he liked it so much, I'd play it with him and check it out. Eventually, we got the Xbox 360 controller
Mas o cara chega o Gabuga Supremo dando um tapa na pantera.
Emulator going, got his Steam account logged in on my computer, and traded death for death the entire way through the first Dark Souls over that first semester. We would play almost every day, nearly always with music on over the game sounds, and in between the games we talked and connected in a way that I never really had with any person to that point in my life. When we came back after Christmas break, he had returned with a copy of the Dark Souls 2 Black Armor Edition for PS3. I had a PS3 in my room hooked up to my computer monitor already, so naturally we popped it in and started playing. That year, there were so many drug-fueled, musically accompanied journeys into the worlds that From Software created. It was practically my life. At the very least, it was as significant as the schooling we were both partaking in. We developed an entire sub-language of shorthand for discussing people, relationships, and the reality we both found ourselves in. At the time, I didn't really enjoy the gameplay as much as the first one, but I think I enjoyed the time spent far more. We were both more comfortable with each other and with the set and setting of my room. The following year, he brought a PS4 to school, and it lived in my room through our entire Bloodborne playthrough. And then we tackled Dark Souls 3 just as it came out. A few years later, after leaving school and moving away, that same friend came and stayed with me for a week, and we played Sekiro in its entirety together over the course of about 3 days.
Isso é extremamente fofo, tá? Tudo que tá sendo dito até agora é a coisa mais fofa que eu já ouvi, fora aquela coisa mais fofa que eu já ouvi antes também.
I've learned a lot from the Souls games. Temperance, patience, and appreciation for subtlety, and the value of having control over my more fearful impulses. But what the Souls games have always meant to me is connection. That first night back setting up Dark Souls 2, me settling into my chair cross-legged,
Os Dark Souls são fofos às vezes? Aparentemente sim.
and him sitting at the end of my bed propped up with pillows, passing my bong back and forth, listening to Coheed and Cambria. I had left home to return to school, but when we sat back down to play this game, that's when it felt like I was finally back home.
Só faltou depois disso nós casamos. Eu tava não ironicamente da forma que ele tava falando, tipo, foi a conexão mais profunda que eu tive. Eu tava imaginando que eventualmente ele teria se entendido que gostava do outro cara. Mas não, é só uma amizade muito forte, muito foda, pô. É o replay que dá significado pro jogo. Eu concordo, na verdade. Dark Souls é muito gay, segundo essa história, mas é muito gay mesmo.
My relationship
Eu gosto, eu sou gay, portanto jogo é gay.
with Dark Souls 2 isn't marked by my first playthrough. Personally, it's the constant replaying of Dark Souls 2 that has given the game meaning to me.
Bromance foi um puro bromance, sim. Quanto a esse aqui, eu acho que todos os jogos da From ficam melhores quanto mais você vai jogando. Talvez a grande exceção seja Elden Ring, mas tem que ver ainda, né? Sendo que eu rejoguei o início de Elden Ring já muitas vezes nesse ponto.
Like for so many others, Dark Souls 2 was my first game in the series. I played the original game as a teen, when I was still living with my parents. My first playthrough was incredibly messy. I had absolutely no idea what the story was, I had no idea where I was going, or how to play the game properly. In fact, I dropped the game a few bosses before the end. But the unsolved mysteries, unexplored world, and untested gameplay styles made me come back. I had a few more playthroughs where I dropped the game about halfway through, I enjoyed trying new styles, but could never commit to finishing. Even
Aprender novos caminhos de Dark Souls 1 é uma delícia. Fazer o Secret da Leg, por exemplo, é muito legal. É muito legal fazer isso. Tipo, eu não sei como dizer, é muito legal você... Cara, encontrar o Cathy pela primeira vez é muito da hora. É muito da hora encontrar o Cathy pela primeira vez. Porque você tem que fazer o Sith e depois matar o Four Kings antes de você tocar o segundo sino. Isso é muito louco. É muito legal isso.
so, I was getting more confident, understanding the story more and more, learning to look at item descriptions and finding new
Não, era antes de pegar o Lord Vessel ainda por cima, né?
shortcuts and secret areas. Finally, I was confident, skilled, and committed enough to actually follow through. On, I think, my fourth character, I essentially blew through the early areas and made my way to Nashandra pretty quickly. I'd finished the game. As I was playing the original, I didn't have a choice of ending, so I sat on the throne. My journey was over. But really, it was just starting. Since then, I've played the game multiple times. Only a few months after moving out and starting university, I bought Scholar of the First Sin for PS4. It was a redefinition of the game and presented new challenges to overcome with new strategies,
Que eu não gostei dele, velho.
and now I know that game well, too. I've lost count of how many characters I've made on both those discs, but now I can blow through the whole game pretty easily, doing crazy fun challenge runs and using underpowered weapons. Well, I still haven't done 2 of the DLC, so I guess I haven't mastered it yet.
Porra, tu não fez duas... Deve ser a melhor parte do jogo, cara. As 10 de Dark Souls 2 são a melhor parte de Dark Souls 2. De verdade mesmo.
I think most of my interpretation of the story has been said before. The light and hope of Majula contrasted with a dying world, characters losing themselves, finding people they'd lost, or finding new hope and friends when they thought they'd be truly alone, the ways in which the greed and cowardice of those in power trample upon the helpless. But I have a personal connection that no one else does. The game has followed me through my growth as a person, from a teen, unsure and hesitant, trying out new skills and expressions of my identity, until finding one I can be confident with, and then trying out new ones for fun. Moving out and having new challenges all over again, and then, several years later, mastering it all over again. Also, this is kind of specific, but it's fun seeing how my skill at unraveling the world and story of Dark Souls 2 has followed my growth as an ancient historian. I haven't played it since finishing my degree. Maybe it's time to see how much I've grown. I still have a few more challenges to overcome.
Eu assassinei Spiders, é muito foda. Eu assassinei aranhas exatamente 12 vezes. Foda, irmão.
The thing about Dark Souls 2 that I felt really strongly is how it allowed me to battle my arachnophobia
Isso é maneiro.
by letting me make
Ah, porque tem aquela porra de que você mata inimigo em Dark Souls 2 e eles não respawnam depois de matar algumas vezes. Que foda.
spiders permanently extinct. My life's been conditioned by situations of being forced out of rooms, movies, games, or conversations by spiders, so it was really empowering to finally be able to just murder each and every one of the bastards exactly 12 times until I rid Seldora of them once and for all.
Isso é muito específico, mas eu achei da hora, não ironicamente. Eu vou pegar um suco pra mim aqui e já volto. Voltei! Porra, mas aracnofobia nem em jogo às vezes você consegue. Mas, well, esperar isso só por vingança pessoal. Exato. Então, em jogo em particular, a aracnofobia é muito forte em muita gente. Por isso que o Little Company tem aquele negócio que os bichos só viram bichos. Tipo, aranha, só fica o texto aranha. É legal, pô. De uma forma esquisita, é um pouco de um texto revolucionário, tipo, uma história revolucionária. É que nem o cara que falou que era anarquista, tipo, viu com uma visão anarquista. Vamos ver isso aí.
What I love about Dark Souls 2 is how brave it was and how it invalidates the decision at the end of Dark Souls 1.
Concordo. Eu gosto que o 2 completamente ignora o primeiro. Tipo, não completamente, mas ignora boa parte do primeiro. E faz o primeiro ser inútil pro segundo, em geral. Porque traz uma visão mais dark, em geral. E aí eu não gosto que o 3 continue a história do 1. Nunca gostei dessa decisão. Sempre achei meio ruim. Mas, enfim. Tipo, eu acho que Dark Souls é mais interessante pelos temas que a lore apresentam e a mensagem geral da história do que pela lore em si. Então o 3 só continuar a história do 1 é meio que... tá ligado?
The lore that's available
Ele faz o primeiro parecer um conto esquecido, e aí o 3 parece uma sequência direta. Pois é, eu não gostei disso, não. Não gostei disso.
To you in the first game basically makes it feel like the choice to keep the fire going is a really important one, to save the world or let it fall into darkness. Obviously there's nuance here, but it feels like a spin on a classic good versus evil binary choice. Then, Dark Souls 2 comes around and says, hey, that big choice you made didn't really matter. The flame works as a cycle, going light to dark and light to dark endlessly. No matter what, we're trapped in this loop. It totally shatters the grand heroics of the first game.
Sim, eu adoro isso. Acho isso muito bom.
For me.
É a melhor escolha possível para uma continuação de Dark Souls, na minha visão.
But then, specifically in the Scholar of the First Sin update, it offers you a different question. What if you could exist outside that cycle? Is there a way to find meaning beyond just letting fate have its way with you? To me, Dark Souls gives you
Imagina sempre super feliz. Ok.
This Camus-style imagine Sisyphus' happy answer to the harshness of its world. It argues that the struggle through problems is worth it in and of itself. That's why the depression metaphor I
Eu não esperava uma menção a Camus do nada, mas tudo bem.
talked about in my Dark Souls 1 response felt so impactful to me, and that was also just where I was when I first played Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 2 is a game that's absolutely in conversation with the first game and its themes.
Concordo.
It agrees that perseverance through pain is valuable, but the sequel also challenges those struggles by asking why they exist in the first place. Dark Souls 2 posits that the endless repetition of lighting the fire or letting it burn out and then waiting around for the next phase to start, pushing the boulder up and watching it roll back down again, is in its own way a kind of resignation, a giving up. This is just the way things are.
O 2 é basicamente, independente do que você fizer, o ciclo do fogo continua existindo. O 3 seria a conclusão de tudo isso. Mas é porque é uma conclusão que pega direto do 1. Sabe, eu não gosto disso.
It says, and dares you to shrug your shoulders and accept it. Maybe, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can put yourself in a better position, reaching the throne and becoming a monarch, getting the cure, a crown that only one person can wear. But the Throne of Want, ironically, isn't really all that desirable in the end. You're just expected to want it based
Eu entendo, eu acho necessário? Ok, tá bom.
on your expectations on how game narratives work, especially if you played Dark Souls 1, and it seems like the place to go and solve your problems. But it'll eventually just put the world back, the same place it started. The desire for the throne is, well, hollow. Like
Hollow.
you talked about in your Dark Souls 1 analysis, it would just perpetuate the systems already in place in the world, except this time, that perpetuation is gonna go down regardless of whether you light the fire or not. The door to the kiln closes and you don't see what happens. It doesn't matter. Dark Souls 2, specifically Scholar of the First Sin, invites you to look beyond the institutions you're accustomed to and craft a better, happier world. As much of a bastard as Aldia is, his presence suddenly
Virou Bleach agora, exatamente.
reveals this alternative. Try to find a way to break the cycle. Reject resignation. Reject the way things are. And try to discover something better. Back in real life, we are in the middle of a very turbulent time where a lot of people, I think, are starting to realize that the struggles and institutions all around
4 anos atrás, tava a pandemia. Tá bom.
us don't need to exist. People are starting to see that we can reject them and craft a better, happier world. Obviously, people have been fighting against the machinations of capitalism for about as long as capitalism has been around. I just mean that it's on my and a lot of other people's minds a bit more often, I think. Dark Souls 2, in a weird way, becomes a bit of a revolutionary text, one that could be read as a personal rejection of pop-depressive nihilism and celebrating the search for meaning, or one that could be read as a more social-political challenge to the way things are, and the intersections between those two and the way they interact makes it maybe the most interesting game in the main series to me.
Eu acho que na ideia temática foi o jogo que mais me pegou. Tipo, em geral, o favorito é o 1, e a história dele e os temas dele e tudo isso, tipo, são meus favoritos em geral, só que a temática do 2 foi o que mais me pegou. É o que eu falei, é um jogo que eu achei, tipo, a atmosfera do jogo tão interessante que eu não tive interesse em ver a história porque eu gosto de só imaginá-la.
Even if Dark Souls 1 is the one I have the most #feels
Exato.
about. It's pretty funny how I read Dark Souls 1 as a very personal journey, and that you read it as a much more political one. Now with Dark
O único pecado Dark Souls 2 é não ter uma waifu doll azul. Justo, Blue.
Souls 2, it's almost like our hot takes and choices at the end are flipped. Lol. That's what I love about these games. And
Pera, a Alexandre traduziu LOL pra RS.
hot takes and choices at the end are flipped. Lol.
Porque azul? Como é que é o nome da pessoa que falou isso? Blue.
That's what I love about these games, and this series. They contain so much meaning to dig up if you put in the effort.
Só que Dark Souls 2 tem pôr do sol infinito, então troca justo e é bonito. Eu precisava lidar com isso da minha própria maneira. Essa análise discute perda parental. Ok.
For me, Dark
Então é isso. Tipo, se vocês têm algum trauma ou meio que um gatilho com isso, recomendo que vocês não vejam esta parte.
Souls 2 means a lot. It was my first Souls game,
Por isso que o Skyen avisou, no caso.
and definitely the one I put the most time into. Though, the time I put into it really came down to escaping from the world around me. You see, about a year before the game came out, my dad died of a brain hemorrhage related to his alcoholism. I took a lot of the blame for that onto myself. It felt like I was responsible, like I didn't do enough to save my dad. Of course, now I realize there wasn't much I could have done, being 12. Because of that, when I ended up playing Dark Souls 2, I felt like that was what the game was about, failure.
Uhum.
I ended up playing the game as a way to seek out answers for what I saw as my own personal failing. Whenever I hit walls in the game, I would look up tips and tricks on how to best handle bosses, and seeing the same onslaught of don't get greedy, get good, and so on, quickly started to mirror how I saw reactions when I talked about my dad's passing. Stock responses that people meant, but ultimately weren't very helpful to me. It was when I reached the Mirror Night that I started to realize what was going on, and what this game meant to me. The Mirror Night was where I came to realize that the guides and tips aren't helpful, that I needed to overcome this on my own, and decided to concoct a strategy all my own. Once I reached Vendrick, things started to make more sense to me. Through my playthrough of the game, I remember Vendrick being talked up as a wise king who could solve all of our problems, and so I began to see him as a figure to answer how I should handle my failure, how I could atone for not saving my dad. Then I reached Vendrick's tomb. At first I didn't know what to think. I was confused and angry. I was angry Vendrick was hollowed. If a man with all the power in the world failed and then just gave up, what was I supposed to do? Why couldn't he have hung on until I got there? Told me what I needed to make things right. From there, I thought about Velstad, a strong, loyal person brought down by the failings of another, and I started to see how my failures affected those around me, how, when I retreated into my own little tomb of self-pity, some friends and family stayed by me, my own Velstads, people who I would inevitably drag down with me. I also saw how some decided I was a lost cause and sought their own happiness. They were my rhymes. It was from this initial thought process that I started to connect things from my life to the game, and once I reached Nashandra, it all began to click for me. When I took the throne, I was disappointed how simple and easy I found the Nashandra fight, but the more I thought about it, the more I preferred that. She was a boss who was easy, but for some reason Vendrick couldn't defeat her. But it couldn't be because she was exceptionally powerful, so then why couldn't he beat her? I thought about it, and then finally I realized Vendrick couldn't defeat her because Nashandra represented his failures, and he couldn't bring himself to face those failures. And that inability to face his own failures and move past them is why Vendrick hollowed. Nashandra came to represent that inability to face failures. I decided that I needed to be better than Vendrick, Velstad, the Lost Sinner, all those in the game who had been consumed by their failures. So I decided to move forward, realizing what I could have done better and what I couldn't change. To me, Dark Souls 2 means so much because it helped me realize that failures are gonna happen, but to allow those failures to consume you is just another path to hollowing.
Isso foi muito bom. É isso que eu tava falando mais cedo, sobre você pegar significado de arte, tipo, cada arte vai ter um significado diferente para cada pessoa. Se ele conseguiu lidar com o luto dele e com a sensação de que que ele tinha fracassado por causa do Dark Souls 2, eu acho isso ótimo. Eu acho isso muito bom pra ele e tal. Eu vou contar uma historinha aqui, meio triste também, então quem não quiser ver não vê, perdão, mas só queria trazer um pouco dessa ideia de luto e jogo por luto. Durante a pandemia, antes da pandemia, lá pra 2019, um amigo meu tinha me emprestado um PlayStation 3 e me emprestou o PlayStation 3 em vários jogos. Um dos jogos que estava lá era GTA V e eu não tinha zerado. Eu joguei e aí eu parei ele em algum momento. Beleza. Aí, eu tinha um amigo que conhecia desde 2013 e em 2019, eu acho que foi 19 mesmo, ele sofreu um acidente onde ele caiu de uma escada e faleceu. Aí esse amigo próximo meu faleceu e eu não sabia como agir, eu não sabia o que fazer. Eu fiquei, tipo, destruído. Mas eu não externalizava meus sentimentos. Eu só fiquei, tipo, em choque e sem falar muita coisa e meio que só, sabe, ali. Fiquei só, tipo, lidando com isso, sozinho, em silêncio. Até que eu decidi pegar GTA V e jogar do zero. E zerar. E eu zerei GTA V. E foi, tipo, muito bom. Não sei dizer, aquele jogo conseguiu me dar vida de novo. Fez eu ficar muito mais tranquilo agora. Tipo, fez eu conseguir voltar a expressar sentimentos e tal. Porque eu tava muito, não catatônico, mas eu não externalizava o que eu tava sentindo. Mas GTA V fez eu conseguir voltar ao normal. E aí, um ano depois, pandemia aconteceu e meu tio morreu de Covid. E eu tive a mesma reação. Só que dessa vez eu já sabia qual que era a minha forma de dar com o luto. Curiosamente, era GTA V. É por isso que eu falo que tipo, GTA V é um jogo muito importante pra mim. Eu não jogo sempre, eu jogo bem pouco. Mas GTA V é o meu jogo do luto. Artemus, muitíssimo obrigado, querido. Você preparou isso por mais um mês. GTA V tinha virado o meu jogo do luto. E eu só sei agora que, tipo, da próxima vez que acontecer alguma coisa assim, alguém perto de mim morrer, eu não vou conseguir externalizar meus sentimentos mais uma vez. E eu vou só jogar GTA V até eu ficar melhor. Curioso. Bem curioso. Que isso aconteceu, mas isso aconteceu. Eu já não tinha renovado, não? Eu acho que sim, Artemus, por isso eu achei esquisito. Mas apareceu aqui, então apareceu aqui. Tá bom.
So as I mentioned earlier, I received a couple of
Uma ótima história, meus pêsames. Valeu.
really long essays about Dark Souls 2, and much as I'd like to read
A legenda bugou, calma aí, deixa eu abrir. Ok.
through them for you now in this video, it would quite literally
Completamente fora do tempo. Quando posso adiantar algum vídeo de metal pesado brabo pra você reagir? Super fora do tema. Extremamente fora do tema.
take hours. So, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read the conclusion of the two long essays that I received. Now, there's a lot more to them
Eu acho que bugou a legenda.
than just the conclusions. Interesting, but few. I have traced the paths of Lucati.
Tá, calma aí.
I have traced the
Agora foi, beleza, agora podemos ver. Basicamente, esse vai ser, tipo, algumas análises muito longas, é isso.
paths of Lucatiel, Vengal, Shanalot, Vendrick, and Aldia through their changes and beyond within the context of Dark Souls 2. What then is my conclusion? That Dark Souls 2 is a game about change? That hardly seems enough of a thesis to stand on its own. If I were to connect Dark Souls 2 explicitly to works in the real world, I would say that Dark Souls 2 is a game about the philosophy of absurdism, as mentioned regarding Aldia, of the attempts to find meaning in an inherently meaningless world, of the struggles to surmount unconquerable obstacles, of the drive to continue and push forward no matter how apparently hopeless. This has its origins in the writings of Kierkegaard and Camus, to name but two, and Camus particularly uses the
É a segunda vez que Camus é mencionado na porra do vídeo. Incrível.
story of Sisyphus to illustrate his philosophy. It is not nihilistic or wholly pessimistic, for its central premise is that there is indeed something to be found of value. It is the present experience, even with the understanding that meaning is transient and struggle is constant, that gives
A noção do capacete de fazer ele parecer calmo por momento? Calma.
importance. Camus asserts that only once this is understood can life be fully, richly enjoyed, and indeed, the characters that make the best use of their circumstances, and all of the ones above, recognize this. Lucatil comes to terms with her inevitability, but her struggle worsens her status, even as it is understandable.
Falar de Dark Souls sem falar de Camus é impossível. Aparentemente, sim.
Vengarl has already found peace in his bizarre, oxymoronic existence. Shenalot has been weathered by believing there is nothing of value in persisting, but is set free by recognizing the uncontrollable cycles of the world. Vendrick fades and hollows away, but only after imparting his comprehension of his failures and his place, and so I imagine him happy now that he has passed his knowledge and hope on to you. And Aldia, of course, asserts that no matter how life operates, it will always be, to a degree, unfair and nonsensical, and his present state could be seen as a sort of peace that follows the most profound rejection of the absurdity of life. The moment when he knows it can be richly fulfilled, though the tragedy is that he can no longer partake. But what of the more general reading? If I do not limit myself to arguing that Dark Souls 2 is a game about existential absurdity, I have written and highlighted how Dark Souls 2 and its world and characters are about change, and it is just one interpretation, one perspective, one reading of the text that is this game. And by itself it is somewhat superficial, since it's easy to just say that the game is about change, a general and almost shallow conclusion. But that is indeed my conclusion, or at least one of the other elements of my thinking outside of philosophy. These characters respond to change, but that's true of all characters in media. What I believe sets them and this game apart is that their confrontation with change serves as the central connecting point around which not just they, but all of the questions of the game are framed in one way or another, to such extent as to be noteworthy. How will you react to differences, and to newness, and to adjustments? How will you bring it about yourself? How will you, well, change? And how will you react to it?
Essa galera é profunda, hein? Caralho. Eu só pensei, caralho, o mundo acabou, que merda, kaká, tudo bem.
Dark Souls 2 is constructed upon these questions. Dark Souls 2, more than Dark Souls 1, I believe, is a piece of fiction about change.
Concordo com essa parte em particular.
How humans respond to it, whether that is fear, acceptance, experience, rejection, or searching, to name a few. It is about how humans interact with its nuances, and how every one of the multitude of responses and ambitions are worthy of consideration and caution, and defy simplicity. It is about how the world moves with change, and in doing so carries people with it. It is concerned with all things, for everything is touched by change. In the same way, all readings are touched by all other readings, and my focus on change is purely to highlight an element that particularly interests me, without suggesting that it is utterly divorced and partitioned away from other interpretations. For me, Dark Souls 2 was most interesting when interpreted as a game about change, for that is a perspective that is not only interesting on its own merits and has ample evidence to support it, but it also invites other viewpoints to color it. And from my personal belief, this exploration of change, on all its layers, makes it a study of the essence of being human. I've mostly discussed characters grappling with personal change, but that is merely the facet of it that calls to me.
No início ele fala que a interpretação dele era a jornada pela vida, no caso do próprio TV. Oh, ok, ok, justo.
The most, and is by no means the limit.
É que a legenda tava zoada, eu só pulei essa parte.
Limit to which this reading of Dark Souls is about change can reach. It is a game about the nuances of an absurdist existence, about how humans change and about how we respond to or pursue change, but its message on the subject goes further still. Questions of alteration can be applied to reading Dark Souls 2 as a piece of revolutionary fiction, as anti-capitalist messaging, as an environmental stewardship persuasion.
É a terceira pessoa que comenta que essa porra é anticapitalista. Vambora.
Piece, as sociopolitical
No caso, uma era tipo antimonarquista, mas tá anarquia.
Discussion.
Anarquismo, no caso. Anarquia não é o caso.
And as religious study, to name a very small number of lenses through which it can be viewed, analyzed, and disseminated. To say that Dark Souls 2 is about change is an intentionally simple answer, but I hope that it makes clear the scope of my assertion, reveals how many
Só anarquistas, vambora.
Layers I think can be absorbed into this perspective, and serves as an accurate and digestible summary of what I think it offers from a
Esse chefe é muito chato, inclusive. Ele só fica chutando, pisando no chão. É um cu.
literary and analytical standpoint. Absurdity works hand in glove with this reading, for the confrontation between an ineffable world and our own individual fragility and the conflict between is applicable to that philosophical school as much as it works with a more general statement of the game's focus on change.
O caixa no meio do mundo que pode te mudar só a cereja no topo. É verdade! Bom ponto, bom ponto, bom ponto.
To live
Quando várias pessoas falam o mesmo ponto, é porque vale a pena ser considerado. Eu tenho essa visão na minha vida, sim. Então, provavelmente tem alguma coisa aí.
is to change, and the universe has always changed. A physicist would assert, correctly, that the universe changes towards disorder, towards entropy. But that does not mean that the stability that exists, transient as it is, lacks value, or that there is no wonder and beauty to be found in what we have. And the world as we know it is changing rapidly. This change can provoke terror, or anger, or pushback, or resistance, or acceptance, and effectuation, and support. There are important considerations to keep in mind when measuring all of these, and a glimpse of this difficulty can be seen in the many facets of Dark Souls 2. It is messy, and difficult, and complicated, and in every respect it lacks easy answers. But such is life, such is choice, and such is change. Such is our fate.
Brabo, interessante. É uma história sobre você. E essa é a última agora.
I tend to make a serious character for my first run, and then absolute abominations for other runs.
Eu nunca faço isso. Todo mundo sempre faz, tipo, um bicho muito feio nas próximas runs. Eu nunca faço isso. Sempre faço personagem normal.
As I'm sure is rather obvious, Polonium Man was a joke character that I made for laughs. I honestly do not remember why I named the character that either, but I really wish I did. I don't think it was a They Might Be Giants reference, but quite honestly, I'm just not sure. I made him, I think, 2 years ago, when I got bored and decided to play some Dark Souls 2 again, only to get halfway through and get distracted by other games. You, playing through the series, was a convenient excuse to finally get back and finish the game again.
Eu tô tentando rejogar esse jogo há muito tempo, não consigo. Meu primeiro foi um bicho verde, cabelo roxo e bigode amarelo. Uma beldade. Que fofo.
While it's never as
Abraçaria-o.
satisfying as the first time through, completing a playthrough of a Souls game is still, nevertheless, a rewarding experience. No matter how awful I feel and how demotivated I am, that has remained true, and it's why the game's so dear to my heart. People meme about the games being difficult, but that's not really true. They're punishing, yes, but if you play smart, they're very much beatable.
Eu acho que a grande parada do Dark Souls é que ele é punitivo. Mas isso qualquer outra coisa.
I always want to share my love for the games with
E aí alguma coisa tipo Elden Ring é muito menos punitivo, só que os chefes são mais difíceis em geral. Não sei se faz sentido.
others, and
Porque tipo, se é alguma coisa como Dark Souls, você morre, você perde todas as suas almas e você volta pra puta que pariu. Alguma coisa como Elden Ring, você morre e você tá na arena do boss depois de cinco passos. Então,
any chance I have to do so, I always take without hesitation, because the games just mean that much to me. I've been stuck in on and off depressive
Dark Souls 3 não acho tão punitivo quanto Dark Souls 2. Eu acho que a grande punição sempre é seu tempo. Quão longe tá a bonfire. E Dark Souls 3 tem algumas meio escrotas.
episodes for the past
O negócio de Dark Souls 2 em específico é tanto de punição com vários inimigos em salas pequenas que é mais chato. É isso, também a sua vida diminuindo cada vez mais quando você morre. Dark Souls 2 parece um pouco mais injusto de vez em quando, mas
5 years now, and I can tell you that even at my
Tá vendo aqui, o cachorro parece que era um glitch, uma maneira de lidar com um glitch que pode mudar seu gênero. E aí eles implementaram isso só pra você poder consertar. Que legal! Ok, maneiro.
worst, if somebody asked me to co-op with them, I'd be down in a heartbeat. The way the games connect people is absolutely fascinating. When asked to explain how he came up with the idea for the co-op, Miyazaki explained, "The origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience, where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip," says Miyazaki. "The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it! That's how everyone can get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. But I couldn't
Isso é real? Ok.
stop the car to say thanks to the people who gave me a shove. I'd just have gotten stuck again if I'd stopped. On the way home, I wondered whether the last person in line had made it home, and thought that I would probably never meet the people who had helped me, I thought that maybe if we'd met in another place, we'd become friends. Or maybe we'd just fight. You could probably call it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people. Oddly, that incident will probably linger in my heart for a long time. Simply because it's fleeting, I think it stays with you a lot longer. Like the cherry blossoms we Japanese love so much.
Que louco. Isso também, tipo... Agora que eu penso, essa vibe do multiplayer de Dark Souls lembra também a forma que funciona o multiplayer de Journey, mas acho que de Journey é mais ainda uma situação similar ao que o Miyazaki contou aqui. Curioso, legal.
What makes Dark Souls 2 so special to me, however, is its personal stakes. The other games in the Souls series are much more epic, with big players in the background manipulating events and trying to get people to serve their own ends. In Dark Souls 2, it's a story about you.
Sim.
It's your...
Tanto que a cutscene inicial é sobre você, especificamente você, e só você. Eu gosto disso.
Your own character's journey. The entire thing is centered around you as you travel through Drang Lake from the Forest of the Fallen Giants all the way to the Throne of Want. Even the endings are presented as personal, rather than as these grand and important events. It's instead just one person making a decision.
Talvez é por isso que eu gosto de não saber muito da lore do 2. Porque, tipo, não importa, a história é minha.
For themselves. It's this personal quality, this inherent focus on one's individuality, that really makes the game stand out as the journey of a person, rather than simply somebody doing something simply for the greater good, or out of selfish desire. The story can be about that, but it's something greater than merely that. An individual's experience in this game are much more varied compared to the other titles. Some might find Lucatiel to be an NPC that strikes them as memorable and significant on their first playthrough, while for me, Lucatiel was more relevant on my second playthrough. Instead, the NPC I remember most is Soldan, of all people. Compare this to Dark Souls 1, where, if asked, everyone will answer with Solaire or maybe Siegmeyer.
Siegmeyer pra mim, sim.
As to which NPC they were the most fond of.
Mas eu não, meu problema é que eu não ligo pra nenhum NPC 2 também, mas sei lá. Eu sei que muita gente gosta do Lucatiel, mas sei lá.
With the most
Eu gosto do Ferreiro de Majula. Ele é legal, eu não lembro dele, mas eu gosto dele.
common exception being for waifu characters like Priscilla or the Fair Lady. Dark Souls 2, meanwhile, has Vengarl, Benhart, Vendrick, Aldia, and even all of the various NPC phantoms and shades to add even more life to the world. I
Cebola e o seu... É inesquecível. Sim, ele é.
guarantee you that there is somebody out there whose favorite NPC is Sellsword Lue and his dual shields of destiny. To add even more to that fact is the open-ended nature of the early game, meaning players will often run around all of the different paths and tunnels fighting the various bosses, meaning even the order that players experience the various parts of the game in are individualized. Somebody could fight the Iron King and then the Rotten and then the Duke's Diaphragma and ultimately...
Eu sempre vou pra mesmo trajeto, todas as vezes que eu jogo o jogo, mas tudo bem.
The Lost Sinner, while somebody else may fight the bosses in the opposite order. Ultimately, that is Dark Souls 2's greatest strength as a game, and one of several reasons that I hold it so dear to my heart. In my opinion, Dark Souls 2 is ultimately the weakest game in the series.
Yes.
It is, rather ironically, focused on being vague and ambiguous in its story and rigid in its gameplay. However,
inclusive descobri recente que tem diálogo secreto pro Ferreiro, André que zoou o Sigmar pela armadura. Sério? Ok, que legal.
it's by far the most unique of the three, and this uniqueness is the true charm of the game, rather than the quality of the work. This is why many people often feel it doesn't quite fit into the series overall. However, I feel like people who say that are missing the point. Dark Souls 2 fits rather well into the series, as its focus isn't about the overall world and its history. Rather, the focus is on what a random cycle of the flame would be like. Dark Souls 1 focuses on the origins of the flame and would later become the cycle of fire linking. Dark Souls 3 is about endings. In that way, it makes sense how so much information is seemingly forgotten about. It doesn't matter to people anymore. What happened in the past so long ago is meaningless to people by this point.
Yeah, justo.
So, that was just a small sample of the many ideas, thoughts, stories, and perspectives that people have shared with me in the days after I finished Dark Souls 2. Thank you deeply to the people who have contributed.
Bom vídeo, bem interessante. É bem longuinho o vídeo também, mas foi muito bom de ver, tipo, tanto a perspectiva de Dark Souls 2, porque um grande ponto de Dark Souls 2 é que ele é muito nicho. Nem todo mundo zerou, e ele tem uma reputação de ser atacado. tipo, sempre atacado por todo mundo. Então é interessante ver alguém que... ver tanta gente diferente expressando seu amor e a importância de Dark Souls 2 pra essa galera. De sobremaneira. Muito bom e muito fofo, uma pitada de melancólico. Até a parte melancólica foi, tipo, escrita como uma história de inspiração própria. Muito bom, adorei esse vídeo. Bem bom mesmo.